Open the pod bay doors, Tom.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
It's exciting to be speaking at OMSI for this event. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Tonight we're going to talk about cryptography and how it's tied to computers, and a little bit about, it's going to mostly be about history. We won't talk about any math at all. And it's also like the title of the talk is a little wrong. We're not actually just talking about cryptography. We're going to talk about cryptology, which is a combination of, hold on, next slide. Cryptology is a combination of two different things: cryptography and cryptanalysis. Cryptography is the art of writing codes and ciphers and like using secret languages or secret ways of communicating. And cryptanalysis is the method of breaking or cracking those secret codes. Cryptology is sometimes sort of described as a science and sometimes an art. You'll see as we get into this that a lot of people who have been prominent cryptologists haven't necessarily been scientists or mathematicians or computer people at all. They've just been very creative folks who came up with incredibly clever ways of doing things. Cryptography is the oldest of these. It has been around for a very long time. Our oldest examples of cryptographic writing are probably somewhere around 1900 BC. And they tended to be substitution ciphers or things that are like substitution ciphers. And so this is an example of how a substitution cipher works. Over on the left, you've got hello mother, which would be your plain text. And over on the right, this unpronounceable mess, which would be your ciphertext. So the way you would use a substitution cipher is you would look for the first letter, H, and you'd find it up here, where it's H, and then you'd substitute it with a K. And you'd go through the entire message and do that same substitution over and over again. These sorts of substitution ciphers were considered very secure. They were very difficult to crack. It's such a mess that you can never tell exactly what sort of key or what sort of system is being used. And for, I guess, about 2,000 years, they were mostly uncrackable. Then, in the 9th century, that's CE, a Arabic philosopher, actually the father of Arabic philosophy, Al-Kindi, was contemplating the Quran and was thinking about how the Arabic alphabet was used in the Quran, and he started counting the letters and how often the letters were used and sort of counting their frequency, and he accidentally stumbled across the first method of cryptanalysis. And ever since then, cryptography, now for another 1,000 years, we have a very, very slow sort of arms race between cryptography and cryptanalysis, where cryptographers keep coming up with new codes and cryptanalysts keep coming up with new ways to break them. But since all of this was being done by hand, with pen and paper, with no machinery or calculators of any kind, it was very, very slow going, and not a lot of really exciting stuff started to happen until the 19th century. In the 19th century, we see that the birth of modern cryptography and the birth of computing, the birth of computers, are very closely intertwined. This fella over here is Charles Babbage, who is known to anybody who studied the history of computers as sort of the inventor of the modern computer. He designed a couple of machines that never ended up getting built, the difference engine and the analytical engine, which were the forefathers of all modern computers. He also cracked by hand, or broke by hand, the Vigenère cipher, which was considered the most difficult and unbreakable of all cryptographic ciphers at the time. And when challenged to do it again, he did it again and again. And it was proved that the Vigenère cipher was insecure, not secret. So at the same time, around that time, we also started to get the first cryptographic machines. And at first, they started off very, very simple. This one over here, you can see this is a cryptographic disk, which is used to help you out with a substitution cipher. It was used by the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. And these sorts of cryptographic disks were in use for a long time, up until kind of the beginning of World War I. Although in World War I, we still had a lot of manual ciphers. You'll see over here on this side a one-time pad. That's an actual one-time pad. I don't know if it said World War I one-time pad, but the one-time pad is a system of cryptography that was invented probably sometime in the 19th century that is absolutely unbreakable if you use it right. Like if you and your buddy have the same one-time pads, nobody gets a hold of your little pads, nobody gets a hold of a crib sheet or finds out any other information. One-time pads are unbreakable. And then over on the other side, we have the Playfair cipher, which was a hand cipher that you would do by hand that ended up being extremely easy to do, extremely to encrypt, and difficult to break. So it actually ended up being used all the way through World War II, and it was not done with machines, it was only done by hand. It's still crackable, you can still break it, it's just not very fun. So World War I was important. In World War I, we really started to see where cracking cryptography and where failures in cryptography could affect the outcomes of things in really, really drastic ways. Probably the most famous is the Zimmerman telegram. So the British government during World War I developed a secret program called Room 40. And this was a bunch of cryptanalysts who were locked away in room number 40 of some secret building. And they had found a way to tap telegraph communications between Germany and the United States. This is before the US had entered the war. The US was definitely not going to be part of World War I. They were very loud about that. And Germany, being really sneaky at the time, had decided that they would bribe Mexico to invade the United States. So this Zimmerman telegram was sent to Arthur Zimmerman, the German ambassador in Washington, who was supposed to decrypt it and then send it on to the German ambassador in Mexico City. However, Room 40 captured the encrypted version of this telegram, decrypted it, and found the whole message, the whole bribe. It's all there. You can look it up online and read it. And basically, Mexico just got to set their price. And the Germans were like, oh yeah, we will pay you handsomely to invade the US and retake your lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, just to distract the United States so that we can use our U-boats more effectively. This Zimmerman telegram and the decryption of it was instrumental in the United States entering the First World War. So without cryptanalysis, the Allies in World War I would have had a much more difficult time. All right, so between World War I and World War II, we started to see the first mechanical ciphers. So these were machines where you can see these things that sort of look like dials that would make your fingers uncomfortable. Those are what we call rotors. And you'd set those and they'd each act as a different substitution. And as you used the cipher to encode each letter, it would click through its key and try to be as unbreakable as possible. They weren't super awesome all the time, but they were pretty effective, and some of them continued to be used up until the 50s or 60s. There was a guy named Boris Hagelin, who was a Swedish engineer that started inventing and selling these, and probably was the only person to become a millionaire because of cipher machines. He sold tens of thousands of them to the United States. He sold them to Germany. He sold them to everybody. They were very popular. So we see here the C35, which was called a pocket-sized encryption machine, a pocket-sized mechanical cipher. It was 6 by 4.5 by 2 inches, and it weighed around 3 pounds. So you had to have like really big pockets. But it was built in the 1930s, and it was inspired by vending machines. The M209 was used by the United States during World War II and throughout the Korean War. And it weighed about 7 pounds and was about the size of a lunchbox. However, by 1943, Germany could crack an M209 message in about 4 hours. So it was only good for messages that didn't need to be secret for more than 4 hours. So finally, this is the machine that the movie we're going to see tonight is about. This is the Enigma. It is, instead of just being a mechanical cipher, it was electromechanical. So it needed electricity to operate. It had an incredibly complicated system on the inside. This patent drawings always make things look way more complicated than they really are. But it had a system of those of the rotors, like we saw before. It had the plug boards along the front, where you could manually plug cables to swap letters. And then it had a couple other electrical features inside that made it incredibly complex. This was invented in 1918 by a German inventor named Arthur Scherbius. He founded an engineering firm. He tried to market these things. They didn't really catch on very well. And then sometime after World War I and before any news of any hint of World War II came around, the British government decided to brag about how easy it was for them to crack German encryption during World War I. So the German high command was like, oh, fine, we're just going to buy Enigmas then. We'll just get a ton of them. And they did. Scherbius, their company, sold probably about 100,000 Enigma machines, and a lot of them were being used by Germany during World War II. It was the most heavily used German cipher machine. And it became more and more complex as the war went on, but we'll get to that in a second. So this is an idea of how complicated it was. So the Enigma had the 3 rotors, the 3 scrambler wheels, each of which could be in one of 26 positions. The wheels could switch places, and each wheel turned at a different rate and did different things. And then you had the plug board, which came by default with 3 cables where you could swap out 3 letters. Altogether, this added up to more than 10 quadrillion possible combinations. It was impossible, or so we thought, for anybody to crack this by hand. The Enigma was seen as sort of the magic cryptographic machine, unbreakable. But as we learn over and over again, this is never really true with encryption. So at this point, encryption had become so complicated that nobody was going to do it entirely through math, entirely through being clever with codes, or entirely through just understanding how the machine works and reverse engineering it. This incredibly disgruntled German named Hans Thilo Schmidt got a job at the German Signal Bureau, basically the central office where all Enigma traffic went through, where all Enigma like protocols were designed, where all of the policy about how you use an Enigma went, and before it was disseminated to the German military. He started stealing Enigma code books and selling them to the French. So the French were getting all of this stuff from this guy, and they were looking at it and they're like, no, this is impossible. Even if we have these code books that are saying what settings they're using, the Enigmas are impossible to crack. Like it's impossible. So they had a treaty with the Polish, and they were like, hey, you guys want this stuff? But we're not using it. The Polish government was feeling super threatened by Germany at this point. This was in the probably 1930s, early 1930s. And the Polish had this organization, Biuro Szyfrów, which was basically their cipher bureau. They gave it to their 3 nerdiest guys. I'm going to try not to mispronounce these. I'm really bad at Polish. Marian Radiewski, Henryk Szygalski, and Jerzy Roszewski. But Rajewski is the one to really remember, and he's the one over here. He, just through looking at Enigma transmissions, just through watching them and charting them out and sort of trying to play with them in his head, he was able to reverse engineer how the Enigma worked and create his own Enigma machine just from watching how it went. There's some really good material out there about how he did it, but it's fascinating. And so starting in probably like 1935, the Poles were able to crack and decrypt all the German encrypted communications. They knew everything Germany was doing. And so they started to feel a little safer until the beginning of 1939, when Germany upgraded all of their Enigma machines by adding one more rotor wheel, which increased the difficulty so much that the system that these three guys had set up was no longer able to crack any German messages in time. And as you know, 1939 was when Germany withdrew their non-aggression pact and invaded Poland. These three guys had a miserable time the rest of the war with lots of adventures all over Europe. But luckily, all of their materials on how to crack the older Enigma stuff made its way to England. Oh, I skipped this great slide with these cool pictures I found. These are Germans using Enigma machines. But I already passed that slide, so. All right, so England. England Room 40 had graduated. Room 40 had grown up, had gotten a lot bigger, and had moved out to this place outside of London called Bletchley Park. They were now called the Government Code and Cipher School. And at their peak, they employed over 7,000 workers, almost all of whom were involved in cryptanalysis and cracking access ciphers. The employees, the people who worked there, included linguists, classical scholars, and puzzle addicts primarily. There are even parts where they got so desperate for finding people that they would send out difficult crossword puzzles in the newspapers and be like, if you solve this in under 10 minutes, please give us a call. And they recruited people that way. So they got the replica Enigma machines. Oh, and I forgot to mention the Bombe, which was the machine that Rejewski had created for cracking the Enigma codes. Like it was a little machine like this that had dials that would turn and stuff, and you would mechanically use it to crack Enigma codes. So Bletchley Park received blueprints for the Bombe and all of Rejewski's notes on how the Enigma worked. And from this, Bletchley Park was eventually able to create their own bombas, mostly through the efforts of Alan Turing. This is Alan Turing when he's 15. It's the highest resolution picture I could find of him. So, Alan Turing was a genius. I mean, he was a polymath genius, like across disciplines. He's one of the fathers of modern computer science. He developed stuff like the Turing test for testing if something is real artificial intelligence. He has the tests for like Turing completeness to determine if a computer language or a computer is actually complete or if it does everything it can, and all this other great stuff. And he was able to also examine the new Enigma codes, find more patterns in them, and build this sort of super bomba, which he called the Bombe. He didn't call it a super bomba. I don't know why. He was bad at names. But each one of these little disks here was one of Rejewski's Bombe machines. And they were programmed into this so that they would test 3 settings at once. And through this, they were eventually able to crack the Enigma. This was huge. Like, their ability to crack Enigma codes probably shortened the war by 2.5, 3 years and saved over 14 million lives. Like, they changed the way that Germany had to use their U-boats. They reduced the effectiveness of the German Navy. They protected all sorts of great secrets that needed to be protected and found out all sorts of stuff that was super vital. But even with this giant machine, Bletchley Park didn't rely entirely on the Bombe to crack the Enigma. In fact, as I was mentioning earlier, almost always now, encryption relies on things like cracking encryption. Cryptanalysis relies on human error. So they would rely on cribs or known plain text. That would happen if somebody had, if Germany had sent the same message using 2 different keys and they'd already cracked one of them, they could be like, oh, these patterns match. We can now crack this other message. Human error, one of the things that was really great, so I showed you before the 10 quadrillion different combinations of the Enigma. But Germany, in an effort to keep their Enigma operators from getting lazy, started giving them all these rules. Like, if you use the patchboard, you can't plug in 2 letters that are right next to each other. Which they were like, okay, this will keep our operators from being lazy, it'll keep our machines more secure. But once Bletchley Park realized this, it reduced the number of possible combinations of Enigma settings and gave them a huge leg up. So in trying to help, the German policies actually weakened the Enigma. And then they also had all of these great spy stories about stealing code books, and a lot of times, especially when dealing with the Navy, they would, take key books and code material off of Navy ships as they were sinking or something of that nature. And if they did that at the beginning of the month, they could do it before everything had been rekeyed, and they'd again have a really big leg up. In fact, even Ian Fleming of James Bond fame was involved in Enigma-related espionage and stealing code books and such. But this wasn't the only German cryptography menace that they faced during World War II. Another one ended up being far more mysterious. You see over here, this is the Lorenz machine. Bletchley Park started intercepting strange encoded messages that they could not decrypt. They couldn't figure out where they were coming from. The messages were very long and confusing, and they put some of their best analysts on it, and they worked on it and worked on it. They eventually started to see some patterns, and I believe what happened is again, there was a human error that allowed them to get a clue on this. There was a retransmission of the same long message using a different key, which allowed them to do certain frequency analyses and be like, oh, these are German words we're starting to see come out here. And they were finally able to start reverse engineering the Lorenz machine, which they hadn't seen yet. And they built this thing. It was codenamed the Tunny. A huge, compared to the Lorenz, like the Lorenz ciphers would fit on this pedestal, but that Tunny, if you can tell here, there's like filing cabinets in the background and stuff. It was like 3 bookshelves. This giant machine that they used to try to reverse engineer the Lorenz. And it wasn't working fast enough. So the Lorenz was only being used by German high command, but these were pretty important messages, and they wanted to figure out what the heck was going on. So they brought in a telephone engineer named Tommy Flowers. Best name of anybody in World War II, if you ask me. So Tommy Flowers developed and designed this beast, the Colossus. This is the first electronic digital programmable computer. It ran entirely on vacuum tubes. It had 1,600 of them, and the second version had 2,400 of them. It was the thing that they used to crack the Lorenz ciphers, but they didn't really get it working and going until 1944. By the end of the war, in 1945, there were 10 colossi in use at Bletchley Park. But this thing, without it, we would not have modern computers. It was a beast. It weighed a ton, like a metric ton, and filled an entire room. Actually, probably an imperial ton. They were British. So the funny thing about the Colossus is, I think a lot of people who read about computers probably have heard of ENIAC, right? The first American electronic digital programmable computer. ENIAC wasn't developed until about 2 years after Colossus, but Colossus was considered such a British secret that even though it didn't really get used much after the 1940s, it was kept secret until the 70s, which means Tommy Flowers, he basically invented modern computing and wasn't able to take any credit for it for a long time. All right, so, and this is where cryptography and computing are really tied together. Once we started getting electronic computers, once we stopped even using the mechanical components like in an Enigma or a Lorenz, the number of operations we could do and the amount of math we could do just multiplied like crazy. And cryptography got faster, speedier. So you can see over here, this is a vacuum tube. These are both, this is a modern vacuum tube and a fairly modern transistor. So vacuum tubes, one of the really neat things about them is they act as an electric switch where you don't have to have any mechanical parts moving, right? Electricity comes in one place and it says, okay, electricity can move across this other place. It was what it allowed us to automate Boolean logic, which is how binary computers work. However, they're super unreliable. They would leak, they would burn out like a light bulb, they took forever to warm up, and also if you warmed them up too quickly, they would pop or burst. And it turns out that there's reports from people using vacuum tube computers that are like, if we don't leave it running all the time, every time we turn it on, we have to replace like 1,000 vacuum tubes. It's not worth it. And then in the 50s, we started to have transistors, which are basically solid-state vacuum tubes. They're just these. They're so tiny. I was going to hold one up and say, you guys look at a transistor, but I could tell you I'm doing that right now, and you can't even tell because you're so far away. And they're just based on material science and like weird quantum properties of different elements. And they do the same thing as a vacuum tube. And over time, we have made them smaller and smaller and smaller. So the first high-frequency transistor was developed by Philco in 1953. And today, we make transistors that are under 50 nanometers across. So, and to give you a sense of scale, a piece of paper is 100,000 nanometers thick. So transistors are very, very tiny. The end result of that is that in your pocket right now, there's a device, which hopefully you've silenced for the film, which can crack the Lorenz cipher, like the Lorenz cipher machine that we're looking at that the whole Colossus was originally designed for, in less than a minute easily, without even draining the battery. In fact, your phones, I have a slide for you, your nice generic-looking mobile phone is in your pocket right now, encrypting and decrypting things faster than anything we've ever had before. And I'm talking like, it's kind of the equivalent of having about 10,000 Enigma machines in your pocket. So if you ever felt like, I don't know, going back in time and winning World War II, you've already got all the encryption necessary. They would never be able to break through it. And that's about it. Like, mostly, I just wanted to get across the point that World War II cryptography, what you're going to see tonight is not just the birth of modern cryptography, but it's the birth of modern computing. Like, without the efforts in World War II, the development of electromechanical cipher machines, and the efforts to crack electromechanical cipher machines, we would not have computers today. And that's it. Was that half an hour? All right. Do you guys have any questions? I can't. You.
So cryptography is still a part of our lives, in a certain way. Is it the same concepts as they were using for these devices in World War II?
Right, so the question was, since cryptography is still a part of our lives, is it the same concept as what they were using in World War II? There are a lot of similar concepts. We've had to change our approach a little bit in order to stay ahead of cryptanalysis. So we're far more careful. Like now, when we develop encryption systems, we test them to see how easily they can be cracked. But it almost always goes back to the idea of a substitution cipher at some level, right? So it's still, if we were encrypting thank you, we would encrypt the T and then the H, and the cipher would iterate as it went through there. But a lot of it is still the same.
Me?
Yeah, you.
So I forgot the name of it, but it was on one of the earlier slides. It was the book, The One-Time.
The one-time pad.
You said that it was unbreakable.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know a little bit more about that and what made it so difficult or unique.
All right.
So challenging.
Okay, so the question is, why is the one-time pad unbreakable if used properly? So the one-time pad, the reason it's unbreakable is that the key, basically the algorithm that's used to encrypt or to do the substitution, changes every single iteration, every single letter, unpredictably and randomly. So you basically have to have a key as long as what you're encrypting. This is different than if you are, like if you're encrypting like a one-page thing, you might have like one sentence that uses your key and you run it through an algorithm over and over to encrypt stuff. But with a one-time pad, you'd have to have a one-page key to encrypt a one-page thing. So the reason is because since there's no repetition in the key and there's no predictability to the key, if I gave you something that was encrypted with a one-time pad, let's say I gave you a one page, you could decrypt to any one page of text in existence. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes? You're asking if the NSA leak by Snowden. So the question is, did the NSA leak by Edward Snowden cause encryption to be stronger these days? We haven't really come up with a whole lot of much stronger encryption lately. Part of that is because the cryptographic community is incredibly paranoid to begin with, and they're always trying to use the strongest encryption and always trying to force us to use the strongest encryption. So we do have like newer algorithms that are happening right now. I don't know that they're happening because of the NSA leak, but it is causing people to look more carefully at algorithms we already are using. Yes. Way up. Oh. I'll do orange shirt and then you. Okay. All right.
So we talked a lot about substituting just different types of alphabetical type things. So how does that work like with more pictographical type language, like a Chinese or something like that? How do those types of languages encrypt?
All right. So the question is, I'm repeating your question for the my microphones here. The question is. We talked about alphabetic substitutions, but how does it work for more pictographical? And the example used was Chinese. But if we're looking at computer data, it happens by byte, or sometimes by bit. So it's the encryption is not. It doesn't care if you're using an alphabet now. It operates on the bytes in the computer. And then, all right, two more. Way super up at the top there. Yeah, so the question is encryption what's being used when you go online and you're told that a website is secure? Yes, SSL, Secure Socket Layer, is an encryption protocol, yes. And then, who was, all right, you there.
So how does the Turing machine know when to stop? Like how does it know when it's deciphered something?
So the question is, how does the machine know when it's deciphered something? My understanding of the Bombe of Turing's machine is that it would spit out guesses, and then somebody would be watching and be like, "Oh, that's a German word. We got it." I don't know, and that's typically kind of how you have to do it. You have to know what the plain text, what the message is actually going to look like. Okay, do one more. Okay, you're the last one.
Have you done Morse code before?
Have I done Morse code before? Oh, the question is, have I done Morse code before? I mean, I suppose I don't know Morse code, but I've certainly sent an SOS or something. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed the movie.